Catherine, you're still such a thoughtless, useless wife. This trip was supposed to be a fun time with my son. You who have nothing to do with this can just go back home. Planned as a foreign trip at my husband's request, the moment he leaves the room, my mother-in-law starts to relentlessly pick on me. Given how things have turned, I guess I have no choice. I'll go home then. What happens to them next is none of my concern. I am Catherine, a married woman working in a foreign company. My job allows for easy schedule management, so since getting married, I mostly work remotely from home. My husband is the type who overestimates himself and wants to appear grand. He's extravagant with money and has never contributed a penny to the household. I didn't notice this while we were dating, but his true nature slowly revealed itself after we started living together. My mother-in-law seems to take pride in boasting about her son. I've heard about mothers doting on their sons. I was somewhat prepared for it and willing to tolerate it, but she is incredibly presumptuous and strong-willed. She doesn't listen to anyone else's opinion, not even that of my father-in-law. She is completely convinced that her son is perfect, which is why she seems to thoroughly dislike me. Whenever we meet, she always has a snide remark. She particularly dislikes that I apparently live comfortably on my son's salary alone. She always nags me to work outside since I'm still young. I have explained multiple times that I have continued working after marriage and that my job allows me to work from home, but in her mind, any home-based work is just a side job. She thinks I'm just pretending to work on my computer, probably playing games. Apparently, I'm a useless wife who, despite being a housewife, hardly does any housework and just plays computer games all day. My husband understands my work style, but he has never once explained it to his mother. Even when she speaks like this in front of him, he just turns a blind eye. Even when I ask my husband to explain things better, he just throws it back at me, saying I should get along with her as a woman. He even says he doesn't want to get involved in troublesome matters. Once, when I persistently asked about a similar issue, he even printed divorce forms from the website and threw them at me. Being treated like that and staying silent didn't sit well with me, and I thought about agreeing to the divorce. However, I've heard that divorce is more difficult than getting married. The thought of something more troublesome than my current situation is honestly a problem, so I end up accepting what my husband says. I've come to understand that he always prioritizes his mother. It's frustrating, but I feel I should find a way to handle this while skillfully avoiding conflict. I didn't agree to a divorce because of this mindset shift, but my husband seems to think it's because I'm madly in love with him and didn't want to break up. His arrogant attitude is getting worse day by day. A child acting all high and mighty can be endearing, but when an adult does it, it's just off-putting. I've learned to ignore my husband's grandiose words and to overlook his actions. There's another reason I didn't go for a divorce. It's because of the distance. We live quite far from his parents' home for the reason of husband's job place. We meet his mother once a year, twice at most. I thought I could tolerate that much. While everyone was talking about using paid leave for several days of vacation, both my husband and I were working. My schedule doesn't really follow the American calendar, but rather the global situation. My husband's schedule is more aligned with the calendar, and he hasn't ever had a long vacation. One working day after a weekend, he came home from work and suddenly said, "Let's go on an overseas trip." When I asked why, he mentioned that one of his colleagues had boasted about using his leave for a 9-day vacation and going on an overseas trip, which made him feel envious and frustrated. I was dumbfounded by his childlike pettiness, but indeed, we hadn't gone on a trip this year. So I suggested a domestic trip. That's because my husband has no experience with overseas travel and would need to start with applying for a passport.
You're fluent in languages, so there shouldn't be a problem.
I have experience studying abroad during my student days and have been on several overseas trips when I was single. I can manage conversations in Spanish, French, and German. When my mother got into Korean dramas, I learned Korean with her, but I'm not too confident in it since I haven't used it much. Certainly compared to my husband, I might be proficient in languages, but that doesn't mean the passport application will be completed immediately. I tried to persuade him to choose a trip in summer or winter, if it had to be overseas, but he wouldn't listen. Instead, he decided on the country to visit on his own, took leave without consulting, and dictated the schedule to me. Isn't it a tour package?
Why do I have to travel with strangers?
He insisted that since I could speak French, there would be no problem. I realized he was completely planning to use me as a tour guide and interpreter. I thought it might be okay if it's just the two of us, but then he said,
Oh, I forgot to tell you. I promised to take Mom along. You'll handle that too, right?
Your mother too? I can't handle two people with no overseas experience.
Do some filial piety for once. If you do this favor, maybe things will get a bit smoother, right? I'm such a kind and good husband, aren't I? This is for your benefit too. Be grateful.
His words were obnoxious, but arguing seemed foolish. So I quietly made the reservations as he asked and came up with another idea. From applying for my husband and mother-in-law's passports to booking flights and hotels, it was a hassle. But I endured it to execute my plan and created a perfect itinerary fulfilling all of my husband's wishes. On the day of the overseas trip, my mother-in-law, unaware of my efforts, was childishly excited. That's my son for you. Traveling abroad means long flights. We're in business class seats, right? My husband probably bragged about taking us on the trip, claiming he made the reservations and planned everything, making himself look big. In reality, he did nothing. I did it all. They didn't do anything themselves and left all the procedures to me. Moreover, they had almost no experience with airports and wandered off while I was handling the procedures, causing trouble when it was time to board. Airport staff even offered to make an announcement to find them. They didn't reflect at all, blaming me for not guiding them and accusing me of trying to leave them behind and have fun alone. During the flight, they were relatively calm, but it was annoying and embarrassing how they kept calling the cabin crew. After several hours, we arrived at our destination. After completing the immigration procedures, I thought we could head straight to the hotel for a break, but then my husband turned pale and said,
I need to go to the bathroom,
before shoving his luggage onto me and running off. It was baffling why only my husband got sick after eating the same food. He was just grinning at his favorite cabin crew earlier. Maybe it was divine punishment. Serves him right. Catherine, you really are an inconsiderate wife. How long do you plan to stay here? Excuse me? This trip is something my son planned for me. It's supposed to be a mother-son trip. You freeloader. It's audacious of you to try and enjoy this trip for free. Go back home already. Are you sure? Sure or not. I can't enjoy this with you around. I see. That's unfortunate. All right then, I'll leave now. I handed my husband's luggage to my mother-in-law, had only my carry-on with me, and turned my back on her. She looked dumbfounded, holding his bags. Her reaction was unexpected, considering she told me to leave. I struggled to suppress my laughter. My husband was repeatedly going in and out of the bathroom, so we didn't cross paths. Luckily, I got a ticket back to the US and became a passenger heading home. Originally, I planned to find an opportunity to return to New York alone. I would have been fine playing tour guide for a harmonious relationship, but not with that mother and son. It was just stress with no benefits for me. The thought of the two of them, who can't speak anything but English, being left behind made me grin. They could use translation apps on their smartphones, but my arrogant husband would never do that. Upon landing in New York, I made a few stops and headed to a luxury hotel where my parents were waiting. Since my husband told me I should have done filial piety for my parents, I invited them on a trip to a luxury hotel. We took a scenic sleeper train to the location, enjoying the views and meals before the spa. They were surprised to see me join them earlier than expected. When I briefly explained the situation, my parents were appalled. They couldn't believe I had agreed to such demands. My husband kept calling and messaging me like crazy, but I ignored him. I turned off my phone and fully enjoyed the luxurious hotel. After parting with my parents and returning home, I received a call from the embassy. According to them, my husband, after returning from the bathroom, was shocked and furious to find that I was gone. Unable to reach me, he decided to go to the hotel on his own. Lost and confused about the way, a kind stranger approached him in broken English, offering help. But following this person, my husband was robbed of all his money, passport, and valuables. Even my mother had her jewelry stolen. Standing on the street in their penniless state, the police found and protected them, then referred them to the embassy for help. That's how they managed to contact me. The embassy asked me to come and pick them up. They had no bank cards, as their wallets were stolen. I questioned why I, a stranger to them now, should do this, explaining that the man was no longer my husband, as we were already divorced. In fact, I had kept the divorce forms that he once threw at me. Back then I stayed because I heard divorce was difficult, but this time I had reached my limit. I secretly proceeded with the forms and submitted them back then. The court summoned my husband, but he kept ignoring it and didn't even confirm what it was due to his sloppy nature. As a result, the court found that he accepted the content, and I won the divorce without a contest. I had already found and signed a contract for a new place while making the trip reservations. I didn't want to use the furniture that belonged to my husband and me, planning to buy everything new for the new home. So while packing for the trip, I also packed for the move. Only my work tools and favorite clothes were enough to bring to the new place. I sent everything else by courier with a scheduled delivery. The embassy conversation ended without further demands on me. Later, my ex-mother-in-law cried to my father-in-law, and somehow, with his help, my ex-husband and ex-mother-in-law managed to return home. But my ex-husband was furious and contacted me.
You left me behind, and now I find out about the divorce behind my back?
Left behind? No, your mother told me to go home, so I just followed her orders. Complained to her, and consider the upgrade to business class on the flight as a farewell gift. Also, I reminded him that he was the one who first brought up the divorce. I just granted his wish by using the divorce form he prepared.
Do you think such an excuse will work? How much more do you want to embarrass me?
Embarrassment? What about it? I have a better story if you want to be embarrassed. Want to hear it?
What is it?
I heard you're a regular at adult entertainment venues. You have a favorite girl there, right? You've been spending a lot on her instead of contributing to our home. I also heard you got into debt because your demands escalated, didn't you? I had become suspicious of some collection letters addressed to my husband and had them investigated by a detective agency. It turned out he was a good spender but was too obsessive, making him unwelcome. The girl had hoped increasing her demands would deter him, but he didn't stop. I wondered how my ex-husband felt hearing all this. This story would be quite embarrassing, right? If you make more fuss or contact me again, I'll spread this at your workplace. Understood? The girl he was infatuated with actually disliked him. Given his personality, knowing this would be a great humiliation. My ex-husband, who had been so assertive before, meekly replied,
Understood,
and ended the call. A few days later, I received a call from my former father-in-law. He reported that he had divorced his wife. While we had no more relationship, he seemed to have contacted me to expose my former mother-in-law's true nature, as we both had been mistreated by her. He became suspicious of his wife's behavior and, while she was away, discovered she had been using his interest from securities. The money was spent on beauty treatments and cosmetic procedures. He asked for my opinion as a woman, if I had noticed any changes in her, but honestly I hadn't. Despite only meeting her once a year, I hadn't noticed any changes, which made me question if it was really spent on beauty treatments. She had invested a significant amount, yet there was no noticeable change. Maybe there was subtle changes only she could perceive. I thought it was like throwing money down the drain. Naturally, my former mother-in-law, left penniless, turned to her son for help, but he was drowning in debt. Moreover, after divorcing me, he couldn't afford the rent for the apartment and got evicted. Now the mother and son seem to be living in a dilapidated apartment, plagued with drafts. However, the mother refuses to work and continues her beauty treatments. With the burden of debt repayment and her beauty expenses, my ex-husband is working tirelessly day and night. It seems his vanity and desire to appear affluent haven't changed, even with a lowered standard of living. If they are content with such a life, I have nothing more to say. But I've heard through the grapevine that the quality of her beauty treatments has deteriorated, aging her considerably. I cherish my current life where I can work and live peacefully without being dictated by anyone. This experience has reinforced my desire to live a life within my means.
There's no way I'll let your mother hog it all. $6.6 million is too much for a senile old lady, don't you think? The $1 billion in assets in the position of company president will be inherited by my husband, who is the eldest son, and not a single penny will go to your mother, so be prepared for that. Shocked by Rose's harsh words, until now the eldest son and his wife had repeatedly behaved atrociously, as if they had forgotten the favors they owed us. And yet, to think they'd only show interest in the inheritance after John's death. They never once showed their faces to visit John when he was ill. I can't stand the thought of letting the eldest son and his wife have their way. I must find a way to give them a taste of their own medicine. Feeling this, I decided to take revenge on the eldest son and his wife. I will definitely thoroughly drag them down to hell. My name is Emily, a 58-year-old housewife. I live with my husband John. We have one son between us. Our eldest son Mike lives near our home, having built his own family. I want to marry this person. The woman introduced as Rose was dignified, easy to talk to, and seemed to possess a charming femininity. I felt that she could be accepted as part of our family. With that feeling, I consented to welcome her into our family, and the wedding of Mike and Rose went off without a hitch. Among us, John was quite fond of Rose, often inviting her out to meals, and even planning trips for their wedding anniversaries. It seemed that Mike and Rose were pleased with John's own way of celebrating. The wheels of happiness fell off when John fell ill. One day, while doing housework, the phone rang. It was from an employee at John's company, and upon hearing what had happened, I was told that John had collapsed at work. I immediately packed my bags and rushed to the hospital to which he had been transported. John had not yet regained consciousness. Shortly after, Mike and Rose arrived at the hospital. Beside a sleeping John, a doctor explained his medical condition. He probably has about a year to live. Dizzy with the doctor's words. A year? But he seemed so healthy until recently? Unable to accept the sudden declaration of his remaining time, I stood bewildered. Beside me, Mike and Rose were whispering something to each other. After discussing with the doctor, we decided to admit John to the hospital to extend his life as much as possible until the light of his life goes out. Fortunately, John is a company president with ample assets. The hospitalization costs could be covered easily. After finishing various discussions, the doctor left the hospital room to see the next patient, leaving only our family behind. I hold John's hand. It's paler than usual and slightly cold, a harsh reminder of the reality we are facing. Emily, I have something to tell you. Rose addressed me while I was lost in thought. Wondering what it could be, I tilted my head, and then Rose spoke again. We will not come to visit anymore. Seeing John like this is too sad for us. So from now on, please take care of him, Emily. I was so surprised by Rose's words that I couldn't say anything. I understand that it is shocking to see John in this condition, But to never visit again? They might never see John again if they do that. As I remained speechless, Mike continued speaking. It's hard for us to see Dad like this, too. Sorry, but we have our own lives to lead, and we think Dad would be happier if Mom were the one by his side. With those words, Mike and Rose quickly packed their things and left the hospital room. Left alone, I held John's hand, afraid of what the future holds and wondering what to do next. After a while, John regained consciousness. He seemed clearer than I had imagined, and when I told him about collapsing at the company and what the doctor had explained, he became visibly downcast, yet still his eyes were fixed forward. By the way, haven't Mike and the others come? I couldn't say anything in response to John's question. Surely, if he heard about Mike and the rest, it would only make him more depressed. It wouldn't be right for him to be left with regrets when he was told he only had a year to live. With that thought, I deceived him about Mike and the others. They said they're busy with work, but don't worry, I'll be here with you. Yes, it'll be alright because I am here. Somehow, it'll be alright. That's what I kept telling myself. True to their word, Mike and Rose didn't visit at all. Instead, I visited the hospital every day. Every time we met, John would look sadly down and mutter, "They didn't come today either." Unable to bear seeing him like that, I sometimes found myself calling Rose from the hospital's public space. "John is looking very energetic today. He seems lonely not being able to see you. Could you perhaps come even if it's just Rose?" "I'm sorry, but it's too painful to see John. Just thinking that we won't be together for another year." Rose was adamant, refusing to come for a visit. Still, my intuition told me not to give up. I desperately tried to persuade Rose, saying I would even come to pick her up, when suddenly her attitude changed. You're so persistent." I let out an involuntary, "Huh?" in response to Rose's remark. Ignoring my astonishment, Rose blurted out something unbelievable. "I'm sorry, but visiting is such a hassle. If we have time for that, wouldn't it be more meaningful to go out for lunch with friends or spend time as a couple? We're gonna be the next president and the president's wife, you know? We can't afford to waste our time." "How could you say such a thing? Just stop it. Please don't ever ask me to visit again. I'm busy." With those words, Rose hung up the phone without waiting for a reply. I was so disheartened by Rose's unexpected stance, something I could never share with John. "You seem a bit down," John said with concern as he saw me return. I'm fine." My response came out trembling, but I couldn't tell John the truth. So I stayed silent, saying nothing more, and I continued to visit the hospital every day. I stayed in the hospital room from the beginning to the end of visiting hours, to the point where I became good friends with the hospital staff. John always smiled so happily when he saw me. It was that smile that gave me the strength to keep going. A year passed, and John's long battle with illness came to an end. He was so energetic to the end that I doubted if he was really sick. The funeral, the preparation of the grave, and many other things were difficult, but I managed everything alone as the chief mourner. Mike and Rose didn't offer help or even a word of support. They showed up for the funeral, but they didn't greet anyone during the meal, just fiddling with their phones in a corner. Their lack of social etiquette as adults was astonishing. After the cremation, I placed the urn on the altar. John, now significantly reduced in size, had come home for the first time in a while. That's when Mike and Rose spoke to me. "I'm sorry about Dad. We should have helped more instead of leaving it all to you, Mom." Mike said this and gave me a comforting pat on the back. But such gestures did nothing to heal the wound in my heart or the sense of loss from having lost something precious. John had spoken to me happily, but he still seemed lonely, because Mike and Rose, whom he cherished so much, had not shown their faces even once. Thinking about it, I couldn't honestly interact with them. Maybe disgusted by my demeanor, Rose spoke up and said something outrageous. What about the inheritance? Amidst the sorrow, I didn't want to talk about money, but Rose didn't seem to care about how I felt. As I stayed silent, Rose spoke up again. There's no way you're going to keep it all to yourself. $6.6 million is too much for a senile old woman, isn't it? The inheritance of $6.6 million and the position of president will go to my husband, the eldest son. Don't expect a single penny for yourself. That's how it's going to be. I was left speechless by Rose's words. Anger mingled with my sorrow, despite the fact that she hardly visited him, despite her lack of help during the funeral, despite her ignorance of how lonely John felt. Rose's outrageous words spurred me into action. For myself and for John, I resolved to make sure she'd deeply regret her actions. Just wait a moment, please. With that, I took out John's will, which I had received from the lawyer. I had read its contents before, but I felt the need to check the details once more. Mike and Rose looked puzzled by my actions, but this was very important. After confirming the contents, I breathed a sigh of relief. Surely the wise John knew everything. He knew all about the effort I had made, all by myself. John had always been watching over me. That must be the reason for this will. As I ruminated over the will's contents, Rose's earlier words came back to me. The inheritance of $6.6 million and the position of president will go to my husband, the eldest son. At the absurdity of her words, a smile slipped out, and then I couldn't stop myself. I started laughing, clapping my hands, and burst into outright laughter. What are you laughing at? Mom, what's wrong? Have you lost your mind? Mike and Rose looked worried as they saw me suddenly start laughing. But once I started laughing, I couldn't stop. To a third party, my behavior must have seemed quite mad. Wondering if my behavior seemed uncanny, Rose blurted out, We will discuss the inheritance later. Make sure everything is in order, please. And taking Mike by the hand, they left the house. And so I was left alone in the house. I will never accept this. I'm gonna make sure they get what they deserve. I murmured to John's picture. John no longer responded to my words, but I knew he was still with me. Then I had a whirlwind of days. The procedures for the inheritance and dealing with John's company took more time than I expected. When everything was finally settled, perhaps wondering why there had been no update about the inheritance, Rose called. Emily, what about the inheritance? Stop dawdling and get on with the procedures. We've been waiting for so long, you know? That was the gist of her prodding. Indeed, a considerable time had passed since John's death, and it was natural for Rose, who was eyeing the inheritance, to be getting impatient. Understood, I'll try to get in touch as soon as possible. Please do, and don't you dare touch the inheritance, even if you are getting senile. If you do something like that, you'll be disowned by the family. Rose's heartless words would have caused me pain before, but now that I no longer cared about Rose, those words didn't hurt at all. Still, it's not good to keep someone waiting too long. I contacted the lawyer that John was fond of. This lawyer had been present before writing John's will and was keen to explain it to Mike and Rose, responding eagerly to my request for their involvement. Afterwards, I made sure to contact Mike and Rose. As the day arrived, I waited in the house with the lawyer, and then the front door burst open. Where's the inheritance? I won't forgive you if you have your hands on $6.6 million. Saying this, Mike and Rose strode into the house. They never showed their faces during John's hospitalization, but now, when money was involved, they came eagerly. Why would I have touched it? I'm not as greedy about money as you are, Rose, and I would never touch the money before the procedures are done. Rose's behavior was truly awful, and the fact that Mike just went along with it without any objections is inexcusable. Greedy, you don't need to say things like that. Just get on with the inheritance issue, please. That's what we came here for. Frustrated, Rose insisted like that. Finally, accepting that it was impossible to postpone any longer, I asked the lawyer to read John's will. First, regarding the inheritance. Upon hearing what followed, the couple's eyes widened. That can't be. This must be some mistake. The will read by the lawyer contained details about the distribution of the inheritance. It stated clearly that all of John's accumulated assets were to be left to me, not a single penny to his eldest son, Mike. Why did this happen? The reason was also written in the will. Mike and Rose had not visited once during the hospitalization. I knew the reason but kept silent about it to John. However, John noticed something was amiss with me. Suspicious, John had his employees check on the situation. Since Mike was supposed to become the next president and worked in John's company, it was easy to investigate his actions. It turned out that Mike had been talking about the inheritance with his colleagues. I'll soon own the $6.6 million. I feel relieved just thinking about the old man being gone. Upon receiving such a report, John was determined not to leave them any inheritance. What are you doing? I told you to keep the inheritance matter to yourself. Hearing the contents of the will, Rose's face turned red with rage as she grabbed Mike by the collar. Mike had probably let his guard down because he almost certainly thought he would become the next president and that the inheritance was assured. Sorry, I never thought it would come to this, Mike said, apologizing with a pale face. However, such a thing did not calm Rose's anger. After all, she was forced to give up the inheritance she desperately wanted due to a single action by Mike. This happened because you didn't handle things properly. If there's no inheritance, you are worthless to me. We are getting a divorce. A divorce! Rose said those words to Mike. From these words, it was clear she married Mike only for the inheritance from the beginning. It was unimaginable that a woman who was welcomed into the family could have such a terrible nature. The fact that we faced this as a family, trying our best together, now seems foolish to me. But the revenge drama wasn't over yet. I had another decisive trump card up my sleeve. You speak so casually about divorce, as if you have someone else to replace Mike. If it's just about not getting the money, putting a strike in the family register for such a reason is a risky move. It's a strange story by any normal standard, but Rose was capable of doing that, and I have evidence of it. What are you talking about? There's no such replacement, Rose said blatantly, avoiding my gaze. Her action was too much of a yes that I inadvertently let out a laugh. Since you seem to have no idea, I'll show you the evidence I have for now. Wait, please! Rose tried to stop me, but I didn't care and took an envelope from the cupboard and scattered the photos inside it across the table. Mike approached the table with keen interest. Rose, trying to stop him, pulled at his sleeve and pleaded, Please don't look. It's really nothing important. But the difference in strength between men and women was clear, and Mike reached the table anyway. The photos showed Rose with a certain man. The two of them were walking through the night city arm in arm. Each photo showed their relationship was quite close, as if to indicate the intimacy between them. You've been cheating on me, you bitch. Yes, these photos are evidence of Rose's infidelity. I had been consulting with lawyers and trustworthy people about the inheritance issue, and one of them advised me to investigate Rose's background. I decided it was best to be cautious, so I hired a detective agency to look into it, and they found damning evidence. Seeing the photos, Mike's face turned from pale to beet red in an instant. Then he grabbed Rose by the collar and yelled at her loudly. "What were you thinking? Were you planning to divorce me and move on to that guy? You are the worst kind of woman." Mike's loud shouting was justified. After all, the person he had trusted and been with, aiming for the inheritance as a common goal, had been betraying him, ready to cast him aside at any moment. "It's not my fault. The bad one is Mike. You made me feel lonely. You were always busy with work because you were going to be the next president, and you never made time for me. This is your own doing." Indeed, Mike had been dedicated to his work in anticipation of becoming the next president. I had heard about this from John, the president, and it seemed Mike was seriously aiming for that position. Just for your information, Mike is no longer going to be the next president. An employee whom John trusts will succeed him. It was written in the will. At those words, Mike looked as though he had sunk into despair, and rightfully so, since he had put in a lot of effort to succeed John. But all of this was due to their own fault for being blinded by inheritance and status, neglecting their relationship with John. If only they had behaved properly as a family until the very end of John's life, this wouldn't have happened. "Mom, this isn't true, right? Dad would never say such a thing." As Mike tried to escape from reality, I looked at the lawyer and asked, "It's written there, isn't it?" The lawyer nodded affirmatively. Seeing this, Mike seemed to lose his ability to accept reality, his expression gone. "You deserve it. This is what you get for looking down on me." Rose seemed to have a triumphant smile on her face for some reason. However, there's no way Rose will be allowed to obtain happiness alone. "Divorce. I will divorce you and claim hefty damages. So be prepared for that." Damages? When Mike mentioned alimony, Rose's eyes widened. Alimony often brings to mind the image of a large sum of money being demanded. Rose probably had the same image in mind. "Let's not go through with the divorce after all. There's no way I can pay for something like damages." Rose quickly flipped her stance, retracting her own words. However, Mike seemed resolute in his decision. "No, it's definitely divorce. It's already decided." Saying so, Mike left the house with a gust of breath. "Wait!" Rose called out, leaving the house as if chasing after him. Finally, the storm had passed. My tale of revenge is over. All that remained was to watch how their relationship would unfold. As it turns out, in accordance with Mike's declaration, the two did get divorced. Rose seemed resistant until the end, but Mike's determination was firm, and no matter what was said, he intended to divorce. They went through divorce negotiations, and the divorce was amicably settled. Additionally, Mike claimed damages for Rose's infidelity. I had noticed during the investigation of Rose, but she had been dipping into the household expenses for her lover, so Mike also claimed the amount she had misused. Unable to pay, Rose tearfully turned to her parents, but by that time, Mike had already reached out to them, and her parents were furious with Rose. Her parents paid the damages instead, but in return, they made her promise to work like a draft horse in their home, and now she is reportedly working day and night without rest. Rose quickly complained about the life that was a far cry from that of the corporate president's wife. Meanwhile, having lost his seat as a future president, Mike felt uncomfortable at the company and resigned. He is now working as an employee in a general company, living a solitary life. Thus, the troubles surrounding John and me have subsided. To be honest, it was a difficult time. Yet now, having cleanly severed ties with Rose and Mike, I am able to spend peaceful days. The decision to cut off important family members, to be honest, wavered many times. But I could never forgive them for mocking John. It was John's presence that pushed me forward. From here on, I want to lead a life that does not shame me as John's wife in my own way.
When he was born, he was such an adorable son. I poured so much love into him, and my husband and I should have raised him right. Why did it come to this? John grins from ear to ear with sheer delight. Sorry, Mom. His wife, Rose, acts as if she owns the place, lounging on the sofa my husband loved so much. Leave the inheritance and house procedures to me. I stared at them with a stern face. To add insult to injury, John laughs. You should just stay in a facility, Mom. Even if seeing him again this time is after a long period, I understand the behavior of my child. At least things won't go the way you two think. Don't underestimate your parents. I'm Emily, 75 years old. My husband of the same age and I have overcome various hardships in our lives. And most of that is because of my eldest son. When he was little, he was so precious that it wouldn't hurt even if I put him in my eye. Where did I go wrong? My eldest son, John, turned into a major problem child. I gave birth to John when I was 35. Even before we got married, my husband, Mike, had his own business. And after our marriage, I helped him. Thus, our personal lives were extremely busy. Sometimes we had to work almost without sleeping. That's why we had decided to have only one child from the start. We knew he might feel lonely without any siblings, but we vowed together to raise him with love and care so he wouldn't feel that way. We made sure not to spoil him too much while taking good care of him. We taught him manners like how to hold a fork and knife, how to sit properly, and how to use polite language, among other things. We hoped that John would never face difficulties in the future and would be loved and cherished by many, leading a happy life. The overwhelming love I felt when he first said, "I love you, Mom and Dad," is indescribable. Time truly flies. John grew up so quickly. Of course, like any child, he had his whims, but as his mother, I saw him as an obedient, intelligent, and kind child. However, a change began in John at some point. It started around the time he entered high school. By his choice, he enrolled in a common school nearby. Since elementary school, he had loved baseball and joined a local baseball team, and he seemed happy. Then one day, he shared joyous news with us. "I have a girlfriend now," John said, blushing and looking a bit shy. My husband and I found this adorable, and we were happy not only that he had a girlfriend, but also that he shared the news with us. "I see. Take good care of her. Make sure you don't hurt her." To my husband's words, John nodded. I felt a bit sad, but it should have been a very joyous event, or so we thought. From then on, John began to change. He started devoting everything to his girlfriend. It might sound romantic, but it was beyond what we as parents had imagined. First, John quit the baseball team. We wondered, after putting so much effort into it, why? And when we asked John, the reason he gave was, to us, quite surprising. "I want money and time to hang out with my girlfriend," John said nonchalantly. He's a teenager in the throes of adolescence. I understand that feeling. However, to give up baseball, which he had been passionate about since elementary school, just for that reason? Without thinking, I asked, "Are you sure about that?" But John showed no signs of regret. If he says he wants to quit, there's nothing we can do. We tried persuading him several times, but it seemed John's mind was made up, so we gave up. With his team activities gone, John began to work part-time jobs. After school, he would either work or spend time with his girlfriend. He came home late and showed no signs of studying. Before we knew it, John, who was initially a top-performing student, was now scoring so low on tests that it was easier to count from the bottom. We couldn't stay silent about this. My husband and I sat a reluctant John down for a talk. It's fine to spend time with your girlfriend. I'm not saying you shouldn't work. But right now, you're being incredibly foolish. My husband wasn't angry, nor was he disgusted. He was genuinely concerned for John. We explained to John how neglecting his studies now could limit his future possibilities. Having more options in life is always better. Otherwise, by the time you find something you want to do, it might be too late or impossible. My husband, who had given up on going to college in the past, didn't want John to go through the same regret. He was earnestly trying to convey this message. We hoped John would reconsider, but John responded with a sarcastic smile. I don't care about all that. My future is already decided. I'm going to make a living in music with Rose. Rose is the name of his girlfriend. Music? I asked, to which John nodded proudly. We're making music together now. I don't want to work desperately like you and Mom. I want to have fun and earn with Rose. Such a naive way of thinking. Upon asking in detail, it seems he was persuaded by her and thought, that's a great idea. Only a handful of people can make a living from music. Yet, discarding other options at this point is way too risky. I tried to convey this to John, but he didn't take it to heart. Instead, it seemed he thought we were trying to separate him from his girlfriend. From that day on, John started to avoid us. His grades kept dropping, and we received more and more calls and requests for meetings from the school. His behavior also worsened. We tried to talk to John multiple times, but if he's avoiding even a conversation, there's no way we could change him. Just listen, you can't go on like this for your own sake. Think hard about it. John, you'll regret this, please. It might be presumptuous, but we were desperate for John to reform. Yet, John just mocked us. I won't have any regrets. I won't ever become a worn-out adult like you guys. I don't want to. In the end, despite our attempts, John quit high school. I can't count how many times my husband and I cried back then. I never imagined that John, who used to be so sweet, would not even listen to us. And then one day it happened. My husband kept important documents he used for work in a safe. Only he and I knew the combination to the safe. We also kept a significant amount of cash inside for emergencies. And one night, it disappeared. It was definitely there the previous evening, but suddenly it was gone. Without that, I can't get the loan. It has to be somewhere, I'm sure of it. We searched desperately together but couldn't find it. We had to take various measures, but it was in vain. As a result, the company lost its trust and couldn't recover, eventually going bankrupt. What will we do now? It's okay. Fortunately, we can manage to pay back the debt. I also have a potential job lined up. Let's work hard. My husband was employed by a small to medium-sized enterprise, and I took a clerical job. Together, we managed to pay off the debt. Around this time, John was 20. He had been moving between Rose's and other friends' places and seldom came home. When he heard about the company's bankruptcy, John said, "I'm moving out." "What? You guys have debt, right? That's messed up. I don't want to get dragged into it. So, goodbye." I didn't even feel like stopping him anymore. And just like John said, we felt guilty at the thought of dragging him into our problems in the future. We, as a couple, decided to support each other. A few years later, with an invitation from my husband's friend, he became a business owner again. While luck played a role, due to hard work, the company's management was flourishing. We paid off all the debts and even managed to build a house. We both felt relieved, realizing that hard work does pay off. Emily, thank you for sticking with me through this. No, Mike, thank you for working so hard. We never found out what happened to the documents and money that disappeared from the safe that day. A decade passed, and my husband departed this world before me. Despite everything, I truly felt blessed to have spent this time together. With that thought, I couldn't stop my tears even after the funeral. The sense of loss from losing my husband was overwhelming. I had barely had any contact with John since he left home. I debated inviting him to the funeral, but I didn't even have his contact information. Plus, I didn't have that energy, so I decided not to invite him. The day after the funeral, a couple with vivid pink hair and flashy clothes visited me while I was still shedding tears. "Who are you?" Hearing my question, the couple burst into laughter. "Seriously? You don't recognize me? That's crazy." I didn't realize it at first, but his words jogged my memory. The man in front of me was John. "What do you want?" "Geez, Mom, you're so cold. This is a cheerful reunion." The woman beside him burst into laughter again. "And who might you be?" "Oh, you never met Rose, have you?" Despite it being our first meeting, Rose chuckled lightly. I didn't find her very pleasant. "We're already married, so she's your daughter-in-law. Great, right?" Faced with the giggling pair, I felt a surge of anger. I even couldn't care less about the marriage. I wasn't in the mood to deal with people like these. "If you have no business here, please leave." "We do have business. Dad passed away, right? That's why we're here." "What?" John smirked. Knowing all he did, how can he be so nonchalant? Just thinking about my husband makes my eyes tear up. "Look at this huge house you built over time. You must be loaded, huh? I can't wait for the inheritance. I just couldn't wait and had to come over." "Excuse me?" After being away for a decade without any contact, he just walks in and demands an inheritance. Unbelievable. I was boiling with rage. "Get out. There's nothing here for you." John waved his hand dismissively. "You're so naive, Mom. Inheriting is a child's right. Even if you refuse, it's inevitable." The eldest son and his wife were smirking the entire time, but they said, "We'll be back, be prepared," and left. If this goes on, everything my husband left behind will be taken away by them. I don't want to hand it over to John in this state. Forgetting my sorrow, I started to act urgently. I contacted everyone I knew and explained the situation. And I decided to try a certain method. A few days later, the couple returned. Come to your senses. I want to discuss the inheritance. Fine, come in. I invited the eldest son and his wife inside. OMG, this house is so huge. Wow, I want it. I want to live here. As if she was touring the place, Rose looked around every corner of the house. If I recall, she was John's classmate, which means she's around 30. Acting this way at her age? Annoyed, I invited them to sit on the sofa. So, what have you been up to all these years? A bit of this and that. Did some things I shouldn't have, had some close calls. Despite his casual tone, his smirk was quite off-putting. It's hardly something to brag about. What about work? Do you have any kids? I take day jobs whenever I feel like it. No kids. We're not into that, right? John and Rose exchanged glances. Exactly. Kids are such a hassle. If Owen's child ended up like us, that would be a total nightmare. No doubt about it. The couple burst into loud laughter. Right, about the inheritance. I have discussed it with Mike, and there's someone else we want to give it to. What? John's expression suddenly turned serious, and he leaned in toward me. What do you mean? There's a will, so your share might be reduced. I thought you should know. The once laughing couple was now visibly shaken. By how much? I don't know. I'm just keeping the will. I haven't looked inside. The couple fell silent. They must have been really counting on that inheritance. Working day-to-day jobs means they don't have a stable income, so it might be a given. I'll contact you when we look at the will. Just leave your contact information. John and I exchanged contact information. After everything was done, I urged him to leave quickly. John glanced around the room and then looked at me. By the way, where are you keeping the will? It's none of your concern. Don't worry, it's safely stored. I briefly glanced at the safe at the back of the room. Seeing this, John smirked in satisfaction. Well then, I'll be coming again. I felt like sprinkling holy water at him, but that would be wasteful. I had probably given John and his wife enough bait for today. Now, I'll see if they act according to my expectations. It'll be alright. It has to be, right? I murmured to myself, as if speaking to my late husband. The next day, John visited again, this time alone. You were here just yesterday. We don't have anything new to discuss. Why are you here? You're so cold, Mom. We're the only family each other has left. Let's get along. Look, I bought apples. Peel them for me. John handed me a plastic bag. Inside were 5 bright red apples. This many? I love apples. Come on, peel them for me, just like the old times. I sighed and said, fine, getting up and heading to the kitchen. Peeling 5 apples would take a while. The fact that he specifically brought these. Surely John intended to do something today. Everything was going according to plan, but a sense of emptiness and unease spread within me. If possible, I wanted to trust John. After I finished peeling the apples and returned to the living room, John was nowhere to be found. John! I shouted, and my voice echoed throughout the room. A flustered John came rushing back. He looked quite panicked and was sweating. Oh, what's wrong? Are you okay? Yeah, I'm okay. Apples, apples. As John munched on the apple with a crunchy sound, I held my fork and said, "Let's eat." 2 days later, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, there stood my eldest son and his wife, accompanied by a man in a suit. "May I help you?" "Nice to meet you. My name is Eren." The man, introducing himself as Eren, smiled slightly. Why are you here, Mr. Eren?" "I'm an attorney. Today I've accompanied John as per his request." I scrutinized Eren from the top of his head to the tips of his toes. I observed him, literally glaring at him. "I see. So, without any appointment, my eldest son and his wife, along with you, thought it was appropriate to visit me this early in the morning, right? All right then, come in." Thank you, and sorry for the inconvenience," Eren said, looking somewhat awkward as he took off his shoes. As the four of us sat around the table, Eren began to speak. "Today I'm here to discuss the inheritance of your late husband. I'm afraid of the sudden visit." "Yes, a phone call would have been appreciated, so what is it?" This time Eren continued without changing his expression. "Your eldest son and his wife would like to review the will. Where might it be?" "That's quite a bold request. The will is stored in the safe." Eren and John exchanged glances and nodded. "May I proceed to verify it then?" Eren, with a big smile, stood up. The eldest son and his wife also followed suit and stood up. Excuse me, ma'am, the will." Probably because I remained seated, Eren gave an awkward smile and tilted his head. "Please stop acting like a polite person. Call me Emily. Do we need to see the will right here and now?" Eren lowered his eyebrows as if in distress and looked at John as if seeking help. John sighed and spoke to me. "I'm the son of the deceased, aren't I? I have the right to see the will too. Hurry up." Reluctantly, I got up and we all headed towards the safe. When I opened the safe, I took out an envelope from inside. As Eren tried to take it from me, saying, "I'll check it now," I quickly pulled it away. "Don't touch it without permission. I'll check it first." Although Eren looked a bit annoyed, he said, "Understood. Go ahead." And his face returned to a smile. Inside the envelope was a single piece of paper. "Mike hereby bequeaths as follows." Below that, there were details about land, buildings, and bank accounts. After reading its contents, I bit my lower lip. "What does it say?" John snatched the will from my side and exclaimed with joy. "Ah, yes! Look at this! Everything is bequeathed to John!" John, visibly excited, handed it to Eren. Eren stared at it intently and nodded. "Yes, that's correct. Anyway, the predetermined share will also go to Emily. So please rest assured." Rose wrapped her arm around John's neck, squealing in excitement. "Yeah, I'm so excited! So this house is all ours? This is amazing!" "Thank me, it's all thanks to my father," I asked Eren while verifying the will. "Is this telling me to leave the house?" Eren nodded firmly. "Yes, that's right, because this house will be inherited by John." John grinned, looking extremely pleased. "Sorry, Mom," Rose fully treating the place as her own. sprawled out on the sofa. Leave the inheritance and house procedures to me. I stared at the scene with a serious face. Once I leave this house, what should I do? John pretended to think with his arms crossed, then suddenly exclaimed as if he had an idea. Mom, you should go to a facility. John, you're so evil. As Rose burst out laughing, John also couldn't help but laugh. They seemed to be in high spirits. Upon closer inspection, even Edan was laughing along with them. I'd had enough. I approached John aggressively. What, are you going to kneel? No way. Even if you do, I won't give in. Can't help it. I got the inheritance rights. None of you have the right to inherit. The previously lively room fell silent in an instant. What? I finally managed to crack a smile here. Things were going so much according to plan that I couldn't help but laugh. You see, if a will is unlawfully destroyed or forged, the right to inherit is revoked. John's face turned pale and he froze. Forged? What are you talking about? I showed the will to Eran. This is a fake, isn't it? You should recognize it, right, Eran? You're a lawyer after all. Or are you just as fake as this? Eran stumbled over his words. Well, I mean, I knew it from the start. This man was a fraud that John brought along. He's not a real lawyer. The real will is right here. I showed the envelope I took from the drawer, and John's eyes widened in shock. Why is it there? I thought I burnt it. Wait, did I? I thought you might switch the real will with a fake one after unlocking the safe, so I placed a decoy inside in advance. John stood there, mouth agape. I deliberately didn't change the safe's code. You opened it before, didn't you? Looking into John's eyes, they wavered. Soon he averted his gaze. Well, it doesn't matter. Anyway, you guys shouldn't have any business here now. Please leave. John stood there, stunned. Rose was clinging to the sofa, exclaiming, "No way! I'm staying here!" If you're not leaving, I have no choice but to call the police. Upon hearing this, the elder son and his wife shuddered and trembled. Is it really hopeless? I won't receive anything at all? I nodded slowly. By the way, just to confirm one more time, you two don't have any children, right? I told you we don't. I even got my period yesterday. That's a relief. Confused, John tilted his head and asked, "A relief?" So I explained, if you had a child, there might have been a chance they could inherit something. Now I can be at ease. Is that so? The elder son and his wife drooped their shoulders in disappointment and crumbled on the spot. Afterward, I formally completed the inheritance proceedings. I had recorded everything that day, anticipating that the elder son and his wife might cause trouble. Surprisingly, John readily admitted to forging the will. Later on, John visited me just once. He spoke with a serious tone. Mom was right. I was the one who opened that safe. I used the cash. I burned the stacks of documents. He apparently hadn't expected that such an act would lead to bankruptcy. He said the safe opened when he typed something in casually. The passcode was John's birthday. I'm really sorry, he said, hanging his head. His voice trembled. But when he raised his head, his face seemed to have cleared up. By the way, it seems he broke up with Rose. After discovering Rose's affair, they got a divorce immediately without any property division. As for me, I am taking my time at home reminiscing about my husband. I have settled the past and there's no longer any lingering unrest. Emily expressed a faint hope. Now that he's broken up with that girl, I wonder if John will return to being the decent person he once was. She smiled to herself. What John did was unforgivable, but as a parent, hope is something hard to let go of. Her husband must have felt the same. That's probably why he left such a will. In the real will, John's name was firmly written. Aside from the house she lived in, he intended to pass everything else to John. We're both such doting parents, aren't we? Imagining her husband's reaction in heaven, she laughed again, all by herself.
I just bought a new house for $190,000. As she said this, Julia looked at me with a grin. Despite it being my mother's funeral, she arrived late and came wearing a bright red dress with a slit up to her thigh. The relatives were all appalled by Julia's incredible insensitivity, but Mike, standing next to her, just smiled cheerfully. I couldn't help but burst into laughter at the atmosphere around me and Julia's behavior. I'll give you that bank book. My condolences. Mother-in-law, are you being a sore loser? With $1.3 billion, I can live without working and not have to grovel to you, which feels refreshing. Julia's words made me laugh so hard my stomach hurt. Seeing me laugh like that, Julia finally started to feel that something was off. So I decided to tell her the truth. That bank book you have, you can't withdraw money from it anymore. At those words, Julia and Mike seemed unable to understand the situation. Now, it's time for a counterattack. My name is Emily. I am a 56-year-old housewife. People have always said that I'm so laid back that I wouldn't notice a fraud right in front of me, but I don't think that's true about myself. My husband John and I had an arranged marriage. I heard that my mother, who liked him working in her company, arranged a meeting with him as a prospective successor. John is a very calm person who treasures me. People often say they can't believe we had an arranged marriage because even after 34 years, John and I still close and often go out holding hands. John and I have one child who has just turned 33. We didn't decide against having a second one, but we chose not to because our eldest son, Mike, was quite a handful. Mike could hardly be called serious. He barely graduated from university and soon quit the local company he worked for, hopping from job to job. On top of that, he was spendthrift and never contributed to the household expenses while living at home. It was 2 years ago that such a Mike got married. He suddenly woke us up in the middle of the night saying, "I found someone I want to marry." Although we didn't oppose him, thinking that this might settle him down a bit, the appearance of the woman who showed up later at the meeting place left me and John speechless. "Hello, my name is Julia. Nice to meet you." Julia, the wife of our eldest son, appeared swinging her flashy long golden hair, wearing a short dress with a large open back. John and I couldn't even look directly at her, as the dress seemed to reveal her underwear just by sitting down. "This is my girl. We just got registered yesterday." That's right. Oh, by the way, I'm 8 weeks pregnant. Please celebrate with us. We were surprised by Mike's words, but even more so by Julia's, which made us exclaim in shock. The reason they had to marry so suddenly was because they were having a child. Mike, why didn't you tell us such important news? Huh? What difference would it make if I told you? Oh, right, I have no money, so Mom, please take care of the birth expenses. Faced with one revelation after another, I couldn't keep up. But John was calm and held my hand to soothe me. Then he turned to Mike and opened his mouth. Hey, you got someone else's daughter pregnant without being able to take responsibility? Huh? That's why I married her, didn't I? Mike responded irritably to John's valid point. I think that just getting married doesn't mean you've taken responsibility. John seemed to agree with my thoughts and immediately retorted to Mike. You don't have money or a place to live. What responsibility are you talking about? You can't leave just by getting registered. You said Julia, right? Since you're already registered, I won't oppose the marriage now. Aren't your parents here today? I'm disowned by my parents, so I haven't told them about the marriage or the pregnancy. John and I were so shocked by this that we were rendered speechless. Mike, picking up on the atmosphere, clicked his tongue and stood up. So, you're saying we should just drop dead with our baby? That's not what I'm saying. If you're going to be a parent, I want you to be responsible. Julia, for now, we'll take care of you until the baby is born. Fortunately, we have spare rooms and there's a housekeeper. We can offer that much help. However, the conditions are that Mike must earn enough to cover the birth expenses, prepare for a new home, and the living expenses after moving. And Julia, you need to contact your parents. Mike and Julia reluctantly agreed to John's conditions. Julia promptly contacted her parents, and soon enough, Julia's father got in touch with John, and they managed to arrange a meeting. Julia's parents turned out to be very kind people. Although Julia claimed she was disowned, her parents say that they had no recollection of such a thing. It was said that Julia had been meddling with a married couple in the neighborhood and had an affair with her husband. She had been working in the nightlife business since then, and no matter how much her parents tried to persuade her, she never listened, and one day disappeared suddenly. We told Mike about this, but he refused to believe it. To make matters worse, he proudly said, Julia is beautiful after all, which gave me a headache. Since moving into our house, Julia has done nothing. She would sleep until noon, and upon waking up, she'd eat the food prepared by the housekeeper and then go back to her room. On the rare occasion she spoke to me, it was to ask for money to buy things for the baby. And if I refused, she would complain to Mike about all sorts of things, and somehow I would end up being scolded by Mike. However, perhaps because she was sternly spoken to at first, she never showed such an attitude in front of John. When I talked to John about it, he tried to spend as much time with her as possible on weekends. However, it's difficult on weekdays because of work. Julia took advantage of those times to continue getting money from me. Even after Julia gave birth, Mike kept making excuses for not deciding on a new home. I ran out of patience and gave him information on new homes, but he kept rejecting them, saying the rooms were too small or the location was bad. Mike, how long do you plan to stay here? Haven't you found a new home yet? I'm looking okay. We're family, so it should be fine. Or are you saying you want us to live in a shabby place and suffer? No matter how selfish Mike and Julia are, the grandchild is dear to us. We want to avoid our grandchild having to struggle as much as possible. Realizing this, Mike and Julia started to use the grandchild as leverage whenever something came up. Because of this, we found ourselves unable to speak firmly. Then I got a call from the company that my mother had collapsed. At the hospital, the doctor said tonight would be critical, and John and I stayed with my mother the whole time. I called Mike, but he didn't answer. We kept calling alternatively, but Mike didn't answer the phone until the next morning. What were you doing? We called so many times. Grandma wanted to see you one last time. Sorry about that. We were just out, right? With Mike's words, Julia smiled and nodded. Yeah. Both John and I could only tremble with the grief of losing my mother and anger towards Mike and Julia. The funeral is the day after tomorrow, huh? We don't have any mourning clothes, so prepare them for us. Saying that, Mike left the hospital room with Julia without even looking at my mother. I'm sorry, it must be my fault for the way I raised him. It's not your fault. He's the one to blame. It's sad for the grandchild, but it won't help those two if it continues like this. Isn't it time we made a decision? I agreed with my husband and made up my mind. After arranging everything for my mother's funeral, when I returned home, only the housekeeper and the grandchild were there. It turns out they hadn't come back since leaving their child with us the night before last. I made a phone call to a certain place and had some documents sent over. Then I went to my mother's house, and it was clear that someone had been searching for something. I looked inside a drawer and immediately realized what was missing. It was my mother's frequently used bank book and seal. I quickly contacted John. John immediately went to the bank and had the account frozen. Due to my mother's carelessness in noting down the pin in the passbook, about $90,000 had already been used, but it was a trivial amount considering the total. Mike and Julia didn't show up for the wake, and they hadn't returned by the following morning. For now, we prepared a suite for two and left the house after asking the housekeeper to look after our grandchild. Inside my bag were documents with the date and time of the withdrawal from my mother's account and documents considering our grandchild's future. We still couldn't get in touch with Mike and Julia, but everything was ready in case they showed up. I took a deep breath. Even as the funeral began, Mike and Julia did not appear. Could it be that they intend not to attend their grandmother's funeral at all? The sheer absurdity of the situation made me feel dizzy. At that moment, the entrance of the venue started to buzz. The crowd that had been huddled together split to the left and right. Walking through them and into the venue were Mike and Julia. When they found us, they waved my mother's bank book in front of us. Then, an inappropriately cheerful voice echoed in the venue. I just bought a new house for $190,000. As she said this, Julia looked at me with a grin. Despite it being my mother's funeral, she arrived late and came wearing a bright red dress with a slit up to her thigh. The relatives were all appalled by Julia's incredible insensitivity, but Mike, standing next to her, just smiled contentedly. I couldn't help but burst into laughter at the atmosphere around me and Julia's behavior. I'll give you that bank book. My condolences. Mother-in-law, are you being a soul loser? With $8,600,000, I can live without working and not to have girl to you, which feels refreshing. Julia's words made me laugh so much that my stomach hurt. Seeing me laugh like that, Julia finally started to feel that something was off. So I decided to tell her the truth. That bank book you have, you can't withdraw money from it anymore. Julia and Mike seemed unable to understand the situation. Now it's time to start the counterattack. You see, that account was frozen yesterday. Frozen? What do you mean? I was able to withdraw money just fine yesterday. Julia snapped at me, not understanding the meaning of the words. I took out some documents from my bag and showed them to Julia. Julia still didn't understand, but Mike, who had once worked at a bank, seemed to catch on quickly. No, that's a lie. Hey, this is a problem. Why was it frozen so quickly? Unfreeze it, please. It won't be unfrozen until the inheritance procedures are completed. You know that, don't you? It won't be for at least another 3 months, right? That's impossible, he said and collapsed. Julia, sensing trouble, looked at us pleadingly. Mother-in-law, we don't have any money. You can't live like this. Oh, didn't you just withdraw $19,000 2 days ago? When I pointed that out, Julia's face turned bright red and she trembled. Then finally, she burst into tears and yelled at me. That money is already spent. Just buying dresses, suits, and accessories almost finished it off. Why? That's our money. Give it back. Your money? That's strange. That money was supposed to be inherited by my wife, wasn't it? Julia looked at me with a triumphant face for some reason. Then she put her hands on her hips and burst into loud laughter. That will has already been thrown away. After giving that secretary a little treat, he would do anything I said. I had him rewrite the will to leave everything to Mike, so that money belongs to Mike. Julia kept giggling, but she noticed John wasn't losing his smile and looked at us suspiciously. Then John started laughing out loud. Too bad. He resigned yesterday. And about the will, unfortunately, the one he threw away was a fake. The real will has been in my safe deposit box. Then John pulled out a cylindrical holder from his bag, unfolded the paper inside, and began to read. Any amendments made after this will are to be considered fraudulent and must be destroyed immediately. All assets are to be bequeathed to my beloved daughter Emily. Should anything happen to Emily, the person who takes over the company will inherit. However, my grandson, Mike, may inherit up to $19,000, but it's at Emily's discretion. What? Mike? You don't have inheritance rights? Only $19,000 and that's already spent. What do you mean? I got pregnant because you said we were going to receive an inheritance in the millions. I was astounded to learn that the reason for their rushed marriage was such. Mike was holding his head, shocked that his grandmother had left such a will. I glared at Julia with gratitude for my mother's love. The $19,000 is the amount I decide whether to inherit, right? I have no intention of letting it go just because you two spent it recklessly. But I can't pay it back because we already spent it. And the house, we bought it in cash. We were supposed to pay tomorrow. At least let us have that. I brushed off Julia, who was clutching at my clothes, begging, and looked down at her. When I sneered through my nose, Julia's face turned pale. As soon as the funeral is over, move out of the house. We prepared a place for you as a farewell gift. You can leave if you both work. The next paper John presented was a flyer for a rental property over 30 years old, costing $330 a month. Mike looked as if he had seen the unbelievable. You're joking, Dad. You're telling us to live in that dump? I can't work, and I don't want to live in such a dirty place. Looking down on the two as they made such remarks, I voiced my next counterattack. Oh, that's right. Please sign this. What's this, Mom? Are you trying to disown me? Julia hurriedly peered at the document, her face turning pale as she looked up again. What does this mean? Adoption of a daughter? That child is my child, and Mike is renouncing his inheritance. It's just as it's written there. Have you two ever cared for your child until now? You left her with the housekeeper on a whim and never once thought about whether your daughter was alright, did you? You're adults now. You can live on your own, but it's different for the child. I'll raise her properly. As I declared this, Julia's face was ashen. Then, as the final blow, I showed them a certain document. This is a record of your housekeeper's work. Looking at this, I couldn't believe that you were properly taking care of the child. No, that must be because the housekeeper... The housekeeper? Someone who has been working faithfully for us for 20 years. I trust her more. Julia was speechless and frozen. Then, prompted by John, Mike signed all the documents, and just as the funeral staff came to the call for the departure, we bid farewell to the two. After the cremation, when we returned home, Julia's parents had come to visit. They asked to offer incense, and as I was serving them tea, Mom, help me please. We're being bullied by my mother-in-law and have to leave this house. She's taking my daughter away. Julia, who had come to collect her belongings, burst into the living room and screamed. Julia's mother glanced at her daughter and sipped her tea as if nothing had happened. What, Mom? Hey, Dad, you know I hate suffering and hardship, right? You'll help me, won't you? Even though Julia clung to her father, he, like her mother, merely glanced at her and then started drinking his tea as if she wasn't there. That's not surprising. Ever since Mike and Julia got married, we had been regularly reporting on Julia and Mike's behavior, as well as the grandchild's condition. It started with just concern for our daughter with bad behavior, but it seems they finally ran out of patience with a daughter who showed no remorse even after getting married. Oh, that's right. Julia, sign this, please. What's this? Renunciation of inheritance? Why? Why, you ask? It's obvious. You ran away without paying for the trouble you caused here, and then you caused new troubles, hurt such kind people, and even neglected your child. You are no longer my daughter. Don't ever call me Mom again. Julia turned even paler than when I had spoken to her, utterly rejected. Without any concern for Julia's state, her mother pressed on. And don't think you might be forgiven after a few years. You and I are strangers from this moment on. We will never meet or talk again. No, that's a lie. Dad won't say such things, right? Right. Julia clung to her father in a last hope. I had heard before that her father had been lenient with Julia, which is why he had paid the compensation after she ran away the last time. But now her father's gaze was cold. "No, I won't say anything." "Dad!" Julia's face brightened momentarily, but it was soon to crumble with her father's next words. "It's a waste of time to talk like that to a stranger." "What?" Julia's parents did not react to anything she said after that. And when Julia finally gave up and left, they bowed their heads to us. They mentioned damages, but we told them it would be paid by Mike and Julia, and they agreed. Julia's parents say they hired a lawyer to demand that Julia pay back the compensation they covered for her. They hired the lawyer precisely because they wanted to avoid further involvement, and they planned to sell the house and move as soon as they recovered the compensation. While discussing this, Julia and Mike returned to the living room. Unlike at the funeral venue, Mike was oddly assertive this time. "Did you know that coercion into renouncing an inheritance can be revoked later? If we say we were threatened, we can still inherit. Too bad for you." "Oh, I knew about that. Don't worry. Both we and Julia's parents have decided to donate to charity. So, if something happens to us, all the money goes there, and there will be nothing for you." Mike was speechless, his plan thwarted. Next to him, Julia stood frozen, her face pale. "Look, it's strange for outsiders to stay in the house for so long. The rest of your belongings will be taken by a moving company, so please leave quickly." As John said this, Mike tried desperately to say something, but no words seemed to come out. He drooped his shoulders and left the room. Julia glared at me fiercely. "Julia, is there something else?" "Where is my daughter? Give her back." "How strange of you to say. The child is now my daughter, not yours." "She is my child. You're just planning to take all the allowance, aren't you? Greedy." I sighed at the endless talk about money. Julia flinched at my gesture. I smiled sweetly at Julia and delivered the final blow. "Unlike you, I do not need money. It's a pleasure to be able to raise her. Thank you for giving birth to her." Julia let out an inarticulate scream and ran out of the house as if fleeing. After confirming that two had left, I called the housekeeper who had been looking after the grandchild to come back. That night, after Julia's parents left, I was finally able to reminisce and immerse myself in memories of my mother. Later on, Mike and Julia moved into the run-down apartment John had arranged for them. I heard Julia didn't do housework because she couldn't stand bugs, and the house was in disarray. They quickly divorced, but due to a lack of money, they couldn't live separately, and I heard shouting daily. Mike is reportedly working as a construction laborer, but never having worked seriously, he is escorted every day on the job site, while Julia started working at a nightclub. Her youth, once her selling point, was overshadowed by others, and she hardly earned anything. They repeatedly break up and reconcile with different partners, causing a ruckus each time, according to a gossip-loving neighbor. Julia's parents sold their home and moved as planned once they recovered all the money from Julia. Since Julia's father originally worked for a multinational company and her mother was half foreign, they moved abroad. They keep in touch regularly and sent postcards with beautiful scenery. As for me, I've started child rearing from scratch, which is quite hectic every day. However, the grandchild, now my daughter, is very well behaved, so John and I engage in parenting with laughter. John is smitten, allowing her to accompany him to work and even taking her himself. This has led to rapid growth in the company's department that makes children's toys. The company has grown even larger, often featured on television. For my daughter's education, we are also focusing on foreign languages. 3 times a week, we connect with Julia's parents over the phone for a chat and language study. We have plans to stay with Julia's parents next spring. Though every day is busy and challenging, it's fulfilling and happy. As I think about it these days, I want to stay healthy and energetic until my granddaughter grows up, so I'm being more conscious about diet and exercise.
You're saying you paid off the debt yourself. Even if that's true, a wife should respect her husband and keep quiet. Flaunting it like this is just shameless. My husband Jake had debts from before our marriage. The total was $300,000. I was the one who paid off that debt. Jake didn't have enough income to repay it, and he was barely making ends meet on a daily basis. Yet, he wanted me to pretend that I earned less than him and that he was the one repaying the debt. To maintain a good relationship with my in-laws, I had tolerated this for a long time. However, a certain event made me stop doing so. When my in-laws found out that I had paid off the debt, instead of thanking me, they insulted me by calling me shameless. Why do I have to be treated like this? I can't stay in this house anymore. I decided to leave everything behind and go. This would lead Jake and in-laws down a path of downfall. Jake and I are a couple in our 30s. We live with his parents. My father-in-law will retired a year ago, and my mother-in-law Mary has always been a homemaker. Me and Jake both work, but since Jake works at his office and I work from home, I did most of the household chores. I almost do as much housework as a full-time homemaker, yet I earn more than my husband. But my in-laws don't know this. Jake asked me to pretend that our household was running on his income alone. I guess he has some kind of pride. Initially, I thought it was fine for the sake of getting along with his family, so I complied. But it turned out that my husband had a $300,000 debt. Originally, it was a debt incurred by Will from a failed investment, leading to his bankruptcy. However, Jake became the guarantor, so we had to repay the $300,000. I was furious about being kept in the dark, but as we were both working, I thought we could repay it together. But it turned out that my husband's income wasn't enough for the repayment, and almost all of it had to come from my earnings. Then my husband wanted me to pretend that the debt repayment was being managed from his income. In reality, Will had already retired, and Mary had no income as a homemaker. Will's retirement money went partially to the debt, and there was none left. Naturally, all their savings for retirement, invested and lost, were gone. My in-laws believed their son was the one supporting the household. Thus, Jake was treated like a hero at home. Given the absolute trust he received from his parents, he couldn't admit to having a low income. But I didn't want to agree unconditionally to my husband's requests. I was done with surprises like finding out about the debt after getting married. So I proposed a condition to my husband. He didn't fully understand its implications, but readily agreed as long as I would take on the burden of the debt repayment. Years later, I repaid the entire $300,000 debt in place of Jake. I reported this to him in front of his parents. I thought that if I said it myself, even his parents would realize I helped finish the repayment. My in-laws never liked me working despite earning less than their son. Since you earn less than Jake, why don't you focus more on house chores? There's no point for a woman to compete with a man in work. Mary often said that to me. A woman should obey her husband, as she is nothing without him. That's what she believed. That's why she allowed her husband to make pool investment decisions. I thought she would at least acknowledge the trouble she caused me. But things didn't go as I expected. My in-laws praised their son for repaying the debt in a few years. And my husband was flattering his father, saying, "It's all for Dad. I am here because of him." Couldn't he just casually mention that his wife helped too? Irritated by Jake's attitude, I confessed that I was the one who shouldered the debt repayment and paid it off. Then my husband accused me. "Idiot, I told you to keep quiet. Why do you always have to be so assertive?" Even if that's true, it's a wife's duty to uphold her husband. Supporting your husband is the only job a wife has. Neither of my in-laws thanked me. Instead, they criticized me for not upholding my husband, boasting about it like this: "Nothing good comes from a woman being too forward." What's with this attitude of having paid off the debt? You're in a position of being supported by my son. How can you act like that? A woman's income isn't enough to live on, so she gets married to be supported by a man, right? You're saying you helped repay the debt, but you must have only contributed a little, and so on. My husband and in-laws kept hurling insults at me. The next day, things were a bit awkward, but life went back to normal. Since no one mentioned the debt issue, I thought it was over. However, a few days later at a family gathering, I experienced firsthand that the issue was still lingering. Even when I greeted them, not a single relative spoke to me. I realized I was completely ignored and excluded. At first, I wondered why, but then I overheard a gossip-loving relative loudly saying she kept the debt a secret until after the marriage. Her husband and father-in-law had to shoulder it. How shameless of her to claim she repaid it. And it was several $100,000. She was playing around with young male prostitutes. Apparently, she was about to be forced to work in dangerous places, but Jake kindly saved her. And yet she's rebellious, and so on. All of it was made up, but the relatives believed it. Most of them I only meet once a year, so there's not much interaction. Since they don't really know me, it's no surprise they believed someone who fed them lies. They never admitted their faults, hid inconvenient truths, and freely spread rumors as they pleased. Even my husband, who knew the truth, didn't correct them and went along with my in-law scheme. I wondered what I had been doing these past few years. Spending years accommodating Jake's silly pride now seemed utterly foolish. I silently packed my bags and returned to my parents' home. My husband was at work, and Mary was out to lunch with friends. The lunch money also coming from my income. Will was out for his daily walk. So it was the perfect opportunity. My absence caused a commotion only when Jake returned home. Until then, my in-laws hadn't noticed anything. It was expected since I had done all the housework before leaving. I didn't want my absence to be suspected before Jake returned home. I thought it wouldn't have the same impact otherwise. As expected, Jake called me right at his usual return time. When I answered the phone, he said, "What are you doing? Just because some relatives didn't pay attention to you, you run back to your parents' house. I can't believe you could be so selfish just because of some relatives." He has no idea how terrifying it is to be completely ignored and treated as if you don't exist. And to be treated just like a housekeeper by my own husband left me speechless. When I stayed silent, he started complaining over the phone. What about tomorrow's breakfast? Where are my spare dress shirts? My razor blades aren't in their usual place. So I snapped back. I didn't marry you to be a housekeeper. And I didn't agree to live with your parents. Your mother, a full-time homemaker. Is there? Why don't you ask her? He seemed surprised by my response and fell silent for a moment. But then he retorted, how can I ask my elderly mother to do housework? You are my wife, and you. A wife should just quietly obey her husband. I immediately responded that if there are 3 adults in the house, they should share the chores. I also added that I'd be willing to obey someone reliable. But I don't want to board a sinking ship by obeying someone like him. He was still ranting, but I didn't want to listen anymore, so I hung up. A week later, my in-laws started calling me persistently. I considered ignoring the call, but then thought it would be troublesome if they schemed something else. So I answered, only to be met with an immediate angry shout. What have you done? Don't you have any gratitude for the support we provided you? Normally, I would have replied, what are you talking about? But instead, I asked, who is this? In fact, I had filed for divorce after returning to my parents' home. And it was already finalized. I thought it was a natural response to someone who didn't identify themselves but just shouted at me. My response enraged my former in-laws, who yelled, don't play dumb. Don't think you can just escape by running back to your parents' house. That's what cowards do. I argued that since the divorce was already finalized, what was wrong with staying at my parents' house? They abruptly hung up the phone. And a few hours later, my ex-husband and former in-laws showed up at my parents' house. Apparently, they came to confirm what I said. As soon as my ex-husband saw me, he confronted me, saying, don't file for divorce on your own. I don't remember agreeing to that. A forged divorce document is invalid, and he tried to grab me. I brushed off his hand and asked if he remembered the big fight we had before. My husband and I often argued about things like the debt repayment and whether our lifestyle was too extravagant for his income alone. But those disagreements escalated into a huge fight that almost led to divorce. During that time, my ex-husband prepared a divorce paper as a means to silence me. And it even had his signature on it. He had threatened me, saying, if you talk back like that again, we're getting a divorce. I'm serious. He threw it at me, but I kept it, thinking it might be useful someday. So when I thought it was the right time, I just added my signature and submitted it to the office. From my perspective, using a signed divorce paper as a tool in a marital spat was unacceptable. I was thrown into a situation where I had to consider divorce seriously and kept silent to avoid arguments. I questioned him. You threw the signed divorce paper at me, and now you say you didn't mean it. Really? At that, Jake fell silent, looking dejected. Then my former in-laws stepped forward as if it was their turn. They showed me a loan agreement and accused me of doing something terrible. We are family, and when a family member is in trouble, you help them. But to make a contract like this within a marriage, you are a horrible woman. They were completely denying everything I had done. I wanted to scream that I was the one who supported their lifestyle with my income. But I held back, fearing it would complicate things further. Back to the loan agreement. It was a document to avoid gift taxes for shouldering my husband's debt repayment. It stated that I was only repaying on his behalf and that he must repay me later. I wanted to avoid any potential taxation, so I made sure it was clear. At the time, my husband agreed to it without fully understanding its implications. I knew relatives would come again around Christmas, as they did every year. Not all of them, but some visited the family altar in my in-laws' house annually. So I hid the document in the altar's drawer, knowing someone familiar with the altar would eventually open it. The drawer usually held spare candles. My in-laws and ex-husband, being careless about such things, would eventually run out of supplies and use the spares. Human psychology dictates that one would check an unfamiliar item found in such a place. I cleverly used this to expose the truth about my in-laws and ex-husband. Naturally, the relatives scorned them as demon in-laws and a monstrous husband for making their daughter-in-law repay debts. They were already being shunned for spreading lies about the daughter-in-law who even shouldered their debts. It was a disgrace to the family. They were even told never to use the family name again. Their surname was somewhat unusual, so relatives suggested they change it, not wanting to be associated with them. Mary's maiden name was more common, so they might end up changing it. I'm not sure about the legal aspect, but that was their own doing. I told my former in-laws, I worked, did all the housework, repaid your father's debt, and you spread lies about me to the relatives. And to degrade someone's reputation with false stories, is that what families do? This is what they call poetic justice. I said it all with a smile. I had a final word from my still shocked ex-husband. I'll need you to strictly repay the $300,000 I loaned you. Pay on time, or I'll demand full repayment at once if you're late, okay? I showed him the loan agreement with a smile. A smile can be more intimidating than anger in such situations. The three of them, who had confidently confronted me, were now clearly intimidated. They must have thought I wouldn't dare to stand up to them. I must have seemed like a different person in their eyes. I told them to communicate through a lawyer from now on. If they ever showed up unannounced again, or called persistently like before, I would report them for harassment and stalking. They begged me to spare them from involving the police, bowed their heads, and slunk away in defeat. Their departure was the sad retreat of those who had lost. Afterward, my former in-law's house fell into complete disarray. It seems they finally realized that their son's income alone could not sustain their previous standard of living. Now that they knew how much they had depended on my income, it was too late. Perhaps my warning that any further contact would be reported to the authorities worked, as they did not come to me for money. Former mother-in-law apparently decided to start working part-time to maintain their lifestyle. However, finding a job was difficult for someone who had never worked outside before, especially in her 60s. I heard she was struggling to get hired. Will, having worked until retirement, was optimistic about finding work quickly. However, as he was promoted only due to seniority and lacked competence, he couldn't find even part-time work. As a result, they were struggling so much that even daily meals became a challenge. My ex-husband continued his regular job and started doing part-time work to pay back the debt to me, working every evening on weekdays and all day on weekends. All his part-time earnings went to debt repayment, leaving no improvement in his life despite all the hard work. He became so haggard that he looked over 10 years older from his actual age. I heard he made a major mistake at his primary job and was in a precarious position. After a while, I moved out of my parents' house and started living alone. Without being forced to do housework for others and with the ability to focus on work, my efficiency increased, leading to a raise. I'm now enjoying a fulfilling life, able to use my time and money for myself.